welcome to Toward a Quality of Life. I'm pleased to have with me this evening Dr. Anne Alonso, a professor of psychology at the Department of Psychiatry of Harvard Medical School. And Dr. Alonso is director of the Center for Psychoanalytic Studies at Mass General Hospital. I welcome you this evening.
Thank you. Thank you.
And this is quite a treat. You'll notice that I have on the book stand here, you may not have a close-up of it now, but I will have it in the edited version, the basic writings of Sigmund Freud. We're going to talk about psychoanalysis and the founder of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud. And I know a lot of people love the Bible. And this is a Bible of sort. The writing of Sigmund Freud is a Bible of sort. It's a religion of sort. As long as you don't adhere to the religion in a fundamental way or believe it as unchallenged and interpreted in a very strict and constricted way, there's an awful lot of wealth and enlightenment about human behavior in the writings of Sigmund Freud. Dr. Freud has gone a bit out of disfavor in this world compared to several years ago, including among the community of psychologists and psychiatrists. So hopefully we'll give you a little insight into the value and the purpose of rekindling and maintaining an endeavor in this kind of interest, a psychoanalysis of the human mind, of human behavior, a psychodynamic view of what really goes on with people. And I turn it over to you now, Dr. Alonso. A psychodynamic view, what would that convey?
A psychodynamic put forth by Freud, but developed many, many more times, of course, since then, means that you're taking into account both the conscious and the unconscious parts of the human existence. That there are many things out of consciousness that drive us, and that to know ourselves deeply means to explore the unconscious impulses. For example, if you've ever lost your keys on the way to the dentist, then you get it, that there's some unconscious force operating that's stopping you from going to the dentist even though you think you want to, right? It's really that simple. And to know the self more deeply is to live a good life. The unexamined life is often very troublesome and very dull and very deadening.
Now, what about people who might say, and I'd like to just quickly add here on my own, Dr. Alonso has been in psychoanalysis for many, many years. That is, in the study and endeavor of it and the practice of it. I myself began my career very enamored of Sigmund Freud. When I put this book down today to get the set ready, I said, oh, I love this, and yet it's been not really a big part of what I or many people do. Of course it plays a role in how we think about things, but beyond the basic foundation in Sigmund Freud, many of you know that I further went into the domains of neuropsychology and behavioral studies, and yet the value of Freudian psychology remains indisputable. So I thought I'd get that in there for those of you that might be wondering about that. Now, the point again about psychoanalysis being psychodynamic and having levels. Would that be fair to say?
Absolutely.
Levels of consciousness?
Levels of consciousness, levels of conflicted needs and wishes.
Conflicted needs. In other words, that as humans, we're not a neatly cut package that is perfect, that we have both aversions and propulsions towards one and the same thing.
Absolutely. For example, the young mothers who come to me at the Mass General, the trainees, and say, should I be here, should I be home with my baby? Well, you know, the fact is that wherever you are, you're going to wish you were in the other place, that life is full of conflicts and opportunities. And out of these tensions comes a lot of creativity. But it's not a simple mind, and it's not a simple life. The complexities that bang into each other, that bump into each other, that both constrain the human being, also allow that person to be creative and to grow.
All right, and it's not just the push-pull.
No?
But it's also the background-foreground.
That's right. That's
so the dimensions are infinite.
That's right.
Actually, the human mind is infinite, and that's something we've lost in the mix.
That's right.
Now, you said you do group therapy, and
I do.
I'm sure in that experience, you walk away realizing the infinities of the psyche.
Absolutely. It's humbling and it's wonderful to see how many ways people organize themselves and try to build a good life and try to undo all kinds of tragedies in their lives. I like to do groups. I do individual and group work, but I love to do groups because it seems so natural to me that groups are an environment where human beings connect with other human beings, that they reduce a kind of isolation that's really very pathological in the end. To be isolated on the top of a mountain is not a good human life.
To be isolated is to be in a pathologically dangerous position.
Right. I think so.
And we've said that many times that if we want mental health, if we want our kids to be happy and relatively well behaved and relatively reasonable as children go,
Loving.
Willing to go pick up something for us when we ask them to, bring them up in a context of relationship.
That's right.
Relatedness.
That's right.
Not patronizing, but just related, including every human life included into the bigger circle of who we are. And our heart has room for so much and so many.
Right.
Right. Now, you said about the dentist, going to the dentist, being losing one's keys on the way to the dentist, being perhaps a sign that one didn't want to go to the dentist.
Doesn't want to go, right? That's the conflict. You made an appointment. You want to go. You know you want to go. But you also are very afraid, so you don't want to go.
What about the people who would say, why can't the losing the keys be just losing the keys?
Well, but the human beings, I think, are much more intentional than that. That the human life is much more driven in a rational way, although it may be a rational unconscious that's driving somebody. That there's not a lot of understanding of random acts without being connected in an organized life.
So you're saying that things that happen are not merely accidental or flukes of fate or serendipity.
Some are, but most are not. Of course, accidents happen. But most of what we do is an organized, directed effort to move our lives along. It's not simply random. And if I'm forever heading east when I want to go west, then I have to realize that this is some neurotic problem that I should take a look at.
Right. Or if you, like you say, heading east when you wanted to go west. So if there's something you've always wanted to do and you haven't lifted a finger towards that.
In fact, you do the opposite.
And you'd even do the opposite. Or when you do things that you know are harming you and you continue to do them.
Right. You know, there's an interesting talk, to come back a minute to the question of isolation versus social contact. There's some fascinating studies that came out of the West Coast about women with end-stage breast cancer. All these women were severely ill. They were in the final stages of breast cancer. They were all getting the same chemotherapy. And half of them were put in small support groups, and the other were not. The women in the support groups lived twice as long as the others. That was the only variable. And they took half that amount of pain medication. Well, you have to think about what that means. So the mind and the spirit and the human contact provided an extension of life that was not available for the other group. That's a humbling reality and something we have to pay attention to.
So that the sustenance of the life force and the life force to be not deranged or perverted is to be in relation with others. Now, how can you convey to people that there's so much more to yourself, given that the mind is infinite, and that you can believe the psyche and the mind are infinite? How can you convey to people that there's more to yourself than might meet the eye, than you might even, especially in today's era when the conditioning is eat this, look this way, drink that, drive a fast car, go to a concert, dull your senses with loud noises, and keep on rushing. And people often say to me, I haven't got time, which you need, let alone to know yourself. Well, that's gone by the wayside, by and large, mostly. But even to reflect on where I'm going in a very mundane way, never mind the deep psyche. Now, how do you show to people that they have a self?
Well, when people come to me, they're usually in some distress, right? They don't come to me for help unless something's hurting. If I can then build a respectful and trusting alliance with that person to try to help them understand that their symptoms are really not the problem. Their symptoms are the solution to deeper problems. Or else they'd stop doing it. If I have a lady who's starving herself, the problem isn't just to get food into her, right? If we can't get to what she's trying to solve by starving herself, then we're not going to get anywhere. And you build that kind of relationship in which there is trust and respect and mutuality, and then you can invite people to look more deeply in the dark closets that you open for them to look into.
Mm-hmm. And some wonderful closets too, n'est-ce
Sure.
pas?
Absolutely. But they don't know it at the time.
Mm-hmm.
It all feels risky and dark. And some of it is dark.
Mm-hmm.
But some of it, you're quite right.
What is
It's
the
wonderful.
riskiness? Can you describe that?
Well, usually people who've come to me with symptoms have developed those symptoms out of some early fear or trauma or absence of others who could help them along the way. So that to change that way of protecting yourself from those disappointments feels risky. You don't know what's on the other side of the door.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
So it's easier to cling to the problem you know than the problem you don't know?
That's right.
Familiarity.
Right. I don't know that easier, but it feels safer.
It feels safer.
Yeah.
It's not easier. You might have to go through a lot of obsession.
Right.
Yeah.
But it feels safer.
Um,
The relationship is what lends people courage to, touch the snake and you'll see it's not slimy.
mm-hmm.
But you're never going to do it on your own.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. The relationship is what can
It lends
bolster the courage.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. That's why we need each other. Well, we need each other on a bigger plane than that. But
Yeah, although that's not a bad basic reason.
Yeah, but we can't be utilitarian about it. We can't say we need each other because by me having you, I can get to a better place. Maybe
Right.
so, but
I can feel fuller
mm-hmm.
and stronger and do whatever I want to do
Mm-hmm.
better.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Kind of a selfish.
Well, kind of a fulfillment of self,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. A fulfillment of self.
Yeah. Not selfish in a negative sense.
Uh-huh. A fulfillment
Healthy,
of self.
yeah.
So there's lots of reasons for the behaviors we do.
That's right. Some of them we're aware of, and a lot of them we're not.
Mm-hmm. Like if I sit here tapping my
Right.
foot like that,
Right.
is there a reason bigger than me tapping my foot?
There probably
in
is.
all likelihood.
There probably is.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if it bothered you enough, if you couldn't stop tapping your foot and it bothered you, that
Mhm.
would push you to get some help for it. And
Mhm.
at that point, you're taking that which seemed like just a simple habit out of your awareness into something, gee whiz, this means something.
Mm-hmm. And people who are very good readers of behavior
Right.
can read these kinds of clues and know who they're talking to
Right.
and even take advantage of it.
Yeah.
And I'm reminded of Willem Reich's description of character, of every nuance he could notice about someone when they walk in a room.
Right. Character armor, too.
Character armor, yes. Yes. So, but this has been a criticism of psychoanalysis, like when is a cigar not a cigar?
Sometimes, but not always.
Mostly not.
Right, mostly not. Sometimes yes, but mostly not.
Mostly not. I mean, even if we had an eye blinking problem where we blinked our eyes a lot, short of some damage.
It's a biological damage. Sure.
Yes, short of that.
You know, Sigmund Freud was a neurologist, and he began his career as a neurologist. So he was very interested in the biology and the neurology of human beings, as well as the unconscious. He moved to psychoanalysis and had to leave neurology for many reasons, not the least of which is he was told that as a Jew he would never get tenure in the university. So he was forced, if you will, to go start a practice. And that's how he entered the whole world of psychoanalysis.
I see. Plus, weren't his theories, as he was thinking them, really too radical, in relatively speaking?
Oh, yeah, they came under huge attack. He wasn't, by the way, the only one beginning to think that way. You know, Charcot and France and Mesmer were already beginning to notice that there was something about conscious and unconscious. So his theory, like all theory, emerges in a zeitgeist. And there are usually a few other people bubbling around this same area. But it was his genius to organize it into a whole.
Organize it and think it, and if I might say, be very didactic about it.
Sure.
I always found cute. You've got to really like Freud to find this cute. That he might open a lecture saying, now I know, this is to paraphrase certainly, now I know that many of you may have had your doubts when I told you X, Y, and Z, but let me assure you.
His other genius was he could change his mind. Every so often in his writings, you'll see he says, in 1901 I thought this, but now I don't. I think I was wrong. Here's why. So he had this kind of
And you know, it's so important. People call that anecdotal and armchair. It is so important for human beings to think. Think. That's the best knowledge you can have. Never mind going in a lab and measuring something. Let's leave that to the physicists. But for us to think and reflect and relate as hard as we can, that's what's so human.
And to be willing to be wrong.
And to be willing to be wrong. Yes. Yes. Now, you probably would say, I would guess, that when Freud started doing his talking and writing and seeing clients who, I take it, mostly had what he called symptoms of hysteria, which were symptoms of falsely or psychologically believing they had physical problems.
You know, every age has its own version of that. Probably the eating disorders recently that we've been seeing are a version of that. Other illnesses that we see may be versions of that. Every age has what Freud calls illnesses where the body remembers what the mind is trying to forget. Now, I think that's very elegant. And whether we see it in peculiar symptoms now that we're more familiar with, or whether you see it in Freud's ladies, you know, or in the Wolfman.
Mind is everything.
Mind is everything.
Mind is everything.
And when the mind is about to be overwhelmed, something has to happen, and the body tries to accommodate to it. And that's what his ladies, I think, were.
Mind is the all. So, as Freud was proposing, and if you say zeitgeist and also social context, I'd like to mention too, sort of separate from an eating disorder versus an hysteria kind of illness, also more characterologically, how psychopathic behavior is a kind of illness, if you will, or imbalance that we carry not only as individuals, but as a culture.
That's right.
We carry it for the times
well,
we're in now.
We have an individual culture where we have for a long time rewarded narcissistic achievements.
Oh, are we ever narcissistic?
And it's a small drift away from narcissism to psychopathy. And we're seeing it culturally, we're seeing it politically.
Oh, are we? I had a show called the narcissism. I forgot exactly, but it was explaining the narcissism of our ways
Of our age.
that we don't challenge,
Right.
and how it's leading us into some very big blunder, not being able to take the view, even just to consider from stepping inside the shoes of other people.
Right.
Yeah.
Or being modest about what we would think we know.
Being great requires the responsibility of being modest.
Yeah. Yeah.
It comes with a responsibility.
Yes, but easily forgot.
Right. Because we're back to what Freud talked about sometimes, unfortunately, the barbaric undercurrent, the beast within. Could you say something about that?
Well, it's hard not to turn on CNN and think of the beast within all of us. You know, it's hard to hear the reports of how many people dead and to wonder, am I supposed to rejoice because they're Iraqis? Or, you know, so...
Exactly. And the blood is not being shown of the Iraqis. I hear there's thousands dead, and there's many children and elderly in hospital.
Yeah,
I heard
it's shown in the foreign press.
Is it? I did hear a reporter talking who was in the Palestine hotel yesterday, telling what he saw all day. The hospital's full of bloody people. That's not being shown on our television, you know.
But unless we can have empathy for that,
exactly,
as well as for what our people are going through.
Same, like your legs blown off or my legs blown off, you know,
Equally
like
horrible.
it's legs blown off.
Equally horrible.
Yeah, difficult. So the barbaric, and Freud talked about, would it be fair to say that, I know libido is very much equated with sex. I know he had the concept of a death wish as well. Maybe you could talk how that would fit in some of the terms that he used, the barbaric part of people, and then how through socialization or social context, more specifically, structures are built up on top, around, under, convolutedly, directly, and so on top of, you know, some of that kind of nature.
When Freud began to talk about libido and aggression, he was really just trying to sort out love and death. He was trying to sort out, how do you love somebody and move towards somebody, or how do you recoil and try to hurt that somebody, right? That the earliest thinking, remember he was thinking about infants and how do infants do that. And so libido wasn't just sex. Libido was the thrust toward another person, passion for activity, joy, sexuality, you know, childhood sexuality.
Sensuality.
Also sensuality.
Sensuality
Absolutely.
of being alive, a soft blanket, a soft blanket.
That's right. And aggression was not the dirty word we have made of it. Aggression was how do you get up and walk? You know, how do you move your life? Now, over time, those terms have come to take on a peculiar distortion of what Freud was originally trying to write about. So we've seen it as a kind of adult hypersexuality on the one hand, and war and killing and this on the other hand. That's a real distortion of what he was trying to include and write about back then. Now, fair enough, over the years and over decades, meanings change and meanings alter. But when we see a kind of, so he posited, if I may, id, ego, and superego. He said in the id are all these passions,
the id,
libido and
I
aggression,
meant to say,
right?
Yes.
And in the superego are all the rules of law, of civilization. You know, thou
What the
shalt
church
not,
tells you
thou
to do.
shalt not kill. And in between is the ego trying to modulate. If I get too much thou shalt and forget there's a human bubbling person here, then I have a repressive world, which is very grim. On the other hand, if there's no modulating conscience, then these run riot, you know, sex and
Anarchy.
Yeah. Well, and what we're seeing, I
Anarchy
think, on
of the
television.
id.
Right. Seems to me right now we're in the middle of that
Exactly.
with not a lot of modulating ego that I can
Revenge.
see.
People wanting to give back what they got.
Well, and talking about laws and who's going to break the law and who's going to, you know. So hopefully, when all of this has somehow gotten itself expressed, some modulating forces, ego, if you will, we'll begin to try to make some order and commonality and respect among people out of all that. But we sure are not there now.
Well, in Civilization and its Discontents, did Freud say
a
how...
great book, by the way.
A great book.
A great book.
How and when aggression, or not aggression, the id, the barbaric, beastlier sides, urges, drives, that are, like anyone in the battlefield will tell you, that are without controls whatsoever when you lose it, so to speak. What brings them finally to a cessation? We hear, people finally get tired of, what brings it to a point where we start to incorporate?
I think if there has been a hypertrophy, too strong a thrust in any one direction, the body and the psyche seek some kind of equilibrium. And that's what happens to us. After you've run a lot, you need to rest. If you've eaten enough, you have to stop. So the body seeks equilibrium. That's really what the pleasure principle that Freud wrote about was. It's the end of unpleasure that brings somebody to a state of peacefulness. And I believe, as he did, that this is a normal developmental thrust in human beings who want to survive.
It's the end of unpleasure.
Right.
That brings you to a type of contentment or peacefulness.
Equilibrium, right.
Equilibrium. So that's where he gets the reputation for having sort of an aversive view of human nature.
Yes, and I don't think he deserved it. I think he got a black eye on that one. Now, in part, remember when he lived and where he lived. The Nazis were after him and his family. His daughter was arrested twice by the Gestapo before he finally fled. And as soon as he left Germany, his sisters were picked up and destroyed in the camps. So he had a lot of reasons to be pessimistic about human nature. But it wasn't his theory so much. It was the man who was sad and pessimistic.
You think he was sad as a human being?
Yes.
Well, I'm not exactly happy as a human being, in the existential sense of the word. But, regarding war and id-like releases, you also have to say, just like in psychoanalysis and the various fields of psychology, many things can be true at once and in no way negate each other. And that, like you were saying, everything is very complex. You have to say people like war. You have to say there has to be a drive to get out there every so often.
Some people do.
And start letting the blood go.
I don't think we can deny that. Nor do I think we can deny that impulse lives in all of us.
It lives in all of us.
To some measure.
And
So it's not just them.
Exactly. In all of, us. We have to, especially when we have the big phallic machines.
We all have some measure of that. Given the right conditions and the right pressure, we would all wage war.
Exactly. And yes, I do think, however, as in its manifestation, as far as we know it, it's a far more masculine thing than it is feminine at this time. At this time. It could change, but...
Remember that women bring up sons. So, at this time. Whether we insert that in our sons or not is a debate for another time.
Now you'll notice that the things that we've been speaking about kind of have a dynamic to them.
Right. They're moving. They're bumping one against the other. There's the human being's unconscious in motion at all times. It's not a static view of people.
It's not a static view. And could you say, too, besides people having an urge to express a bellicose nature, that there is a dynamic need in the culture at large and in individuals in particular for dominion and submission, and this there you have another kind of dynamic.
We all love power, and there's also an equally strong dynamic need for love and attachment, compassion, and sex. That's just part of being a human being.
Okay, so would this be like a conflicted need, where on the one hand you need to dominate, and on the other hand you need to love and be loved?
Right. Right.
And do those get resolved?
Well, most of us have a lot of it resolved, since we don't go around pillaging and raping and killing. But we may be very aware of both wanting and having and sustaining loving relationships, which at the same time can sometimes lead us to very irksome, angry situations.
You know, and this reminds me too, you had said, you had given us the example of losing one's keys on the way to a dentist as being a conflicted event, personal event. And regarding war, and you saying all of us have it in us, given the right circumstance, to be belligerent and bloody. How many of us say, who would never, in our wildest imaginations as we know them now, not exploring our deeper selves deeply enough, how many of us say in mundane conversation, I'll kill him?
Sure.
You know, someone forgot to bring you something from the store. I'll kill him.
I love him to death.
Can you explain
how about I love him to death for the ultimate conflictual
I love him to
statement.
death. I know. I love him. That's even more.
I love him to death.
That's even more. That's also convoluted. That goes into layers and levels. Could you explain how a simple statement like "I'll kill him" could be not pathologically significant, except in the cultural context, but a dynamic indicator, nevertheless?
Well, I think it can be a safe little expression, like letting the steam out of the pressure cooker. You know, every so often, I think these expressions let out some steam.
And also, they're representative of what you're talking. The idea in psychoanalysis, and like what you were saying before, is that little things we say and do, to say the least of big things we say and do, especially the little ones,
they have meaning.
Have meaning.
And value, even if they sound silly.
And come from subterranean and semi-subterranean and fully conscious and superconscious areas and levels. Is it true that a child is born as a blank slate, so to speak?
No, I don't think so. I really don't believe that. I think a child is born with a certain biology that makes that child more or less resilient. I think the child doesn't exist except in relationship with a maternal environment or a group of people who are mothering the child, people of either gender. I think that, you know, Winnicott was a great analyst. He was an object relationist in Britain. And he liked to say there's no such thing as a baby, by which he meant there's only a baby and a mother in a relationship. And the baby gets to know itself from the mother's eyes and responses. And the mother has this baby to generate her maternal self. And that's, I think, a much more powerful image for me than the blank slate.
Does that, by logic, follow sort of a mechanistic logic that therefore a lot of the insufficiencies you may feel you're left with later on in life stem from mother and past experiences?
And biology and culture. You know, if you were born with a very vulnerable biology, the most loving of families will still leave you lacking a certain sturdiness or resilience. And if you have a very loving family and a very good biology and the bombs are falling in Baghdad today on you, you're going to have a very vulnerable self. So it's really, I can't stress enough that it's all the above. By the way, when I say mother, I don't necessarily mean that one woman. I mean the person caring for the maternal functions early in life. Sometimes it's a nanny, a grandmother, an older sibling, a father.
What used to be called the significant other.
That's right. Exactly. That's a better term.
You talked a lot about isolation with me before we started this show. Could you explain how injurious isolation is as a state of existence,
Yes.
and as a possibility of existence, including in those most severe pathologies such as schizophrenia, which is an ultimate kind of isolation.
It is, as is, by the way, narcissism.
True.
The big problem for the narcissistic, severely narcissistic person is there's nobody else in the world. Right? So I think that when human beings lose a sense of attachment, for me, the primary drive is attachment. It's not libido and aggression. I'm much more in the world of object relations in that sense. If there's nobody to attach to, then the infant, metaphorically, is left feeling, gosh, I must be some horrible person. Nobody wants me, nobody is with me.
You think so?
I do.
You do?
I do. You see children in orphanages. They have this blank, flat, and they, in severe cases, simply die for lack of being
as do elderly. Failure to thrive.
You've got it. Failure to thrive at either end of life. And so I think that there's a corrosive quality to that kind of isolation. Now, I don't mean the person who likes to be alone every so often. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about people who feel disconnected from the world and not a valued part of human relationships. Those people are left feeling there's something fundamentally wrong with the self, and that's the root of shame. People who feel there's something really missing in me experience great shame. It's very different from guilt. You know, if I feel guilty about something I've done to you, I can apologize, I can go to jail, I can atone. But if I feel ashamed, there's nothing I can do about the hole in me, the sense of there's a big crater in me. And so I'm left passive and withdrawn.
Does the narcissist feel that there's something wrong with him or herself? Wouldn't the narcissist feel more there's something wrong with others? What's wrong with this world, that it doesn't work out the way it should?
When it's working for him, yes. But it doesn't take a lot to puncture that kind of overinflated grandiosity. And then, those are the folks who commit suicide, you know. Those are the folks who fall in on themselves because there is no robust attachment to other human beings. That's the most dangerous. I think sick people who get isolated are in great danger. But I mean really isolated. You know.
How about people who have schizophrenia and feel this?
You know, some do and some don't.
Some don't.
Some do and some don't.
Some do and some don't,
Right.
But yet, when you really get to know persons who have that complex, you walk away
It's a sad world.
realizing that the universe they're in may as well be,
Right.
you know, another one separate from the one you're in, and you're
That's right.
you just become this little thing overwhelmed by a universe that is so heavy and remote and unimmersed.
Yeah, it's a horrible state. It's a horrible state. Some people think that paranoia is a way to not be so alone. The fantasy that someone is after you may be easier to bear than the fantasy that nobody knows you exist or cares. There's nobody out there. So it's very tragic and there's no question that these are awful illnesses.
Now, how do you know there's an unconscious? We've certainly referred to it a lot, but
Well, your dreams are a perfect opportunity to explore the unconscious. Freud called them the royal road to the unconscious. And if you remember your dreams, and if you can come up with your dreams and even tell them to yourself, you'll be often amused, often startled to find what you've been dreaming about has a pretty direct relationship to something you're conflicted about right now.
in other words, there is symbolic significance in dreams, which is very important to Freud, the symbolic significance.
It's all symbolic. It's not literal. It's all symbolic.
And if there ever were a species that's symbolic, it's the human species.
Yeah.
Flags, steeples,
All of it.
imprints on coins.
He was very interested in symbols.
That's what we are.
Right.
we're a symbolic people, to say the least, that we write and paint, which in itself is symbolic representation.
Yeah, Jung was very taken with symbols.
Symbols and the archetypes of the unconscious, which apparently meant that certain kinds of images and significances were universal.
Right. The other thing, I don't want to not talk about transference in a discussion of Freud, because transference was his genius idea. He realized that at some point, we really don't see people necessarily clearly. We see them through the lens of other memories of important others that may be suppressed or even repressed out of consciousness. But if I look at you and if I see that you're wearing earrings, and somewhere in my psyche, my aunt wore earrings like that, and I may not be particularly conscious of it at all, but it may draw certain feelings toward you that belong to that aunt. So we unconsciously, unwittingly transfer onto another person the feelings and memories, and especially the dimly conflicted ones that we're trying to sort of sort out underground. That's part of what you do in the hour, what I do in an hour with a patient, is to invite the transferences from the past and to be vested in me. So that the person can see me through the haze of the transferential assumptions and get a different experience from me from what he expected back then. That's a way that he begins to know more deeply what he is struggling with every day with the subway and the...
Very important. I hope we could hear that loud and clearly. That's a very important principle.
Yeah.
That we don't see things. That's why when logicians and mathematicians do studies of human choice, they say humans aren't rational.
Why not?
It's really not possible. The most we can do is struggle to use our brains, and that's why the onus is on us to struggle to use our brains to become more rational. We're somewhat rational some of the time. And also, you talked in terms of affect and what you might have felt conflictedly or straight ahead about someone in your past, dimly, etc. But even we put upon people social contexts, sociological contexts when we look at them. And the bigger impression is probably the instantaneous one, sometimes overcome by the longer term.
Right, by getting to know people better, but the instantaneous comes from the behind, from the unconscious past.
Again, indicating the levels and layers that are up, down, east, west, convoluted and very, very complex. Again, the mind and the psyche being all that you are and all that we are and all that is, the psyche. Very...
It's vibrant.
It's vibrant.
It's vibrant.
And when people can relate, which we don't, which most of us don't have the opportunity. I lived in the heyday of psychotherapy, which now has a name that doesn't become it what it really comes out mostly. But oh boy, that was a time of revelation to sit around and explore. That's what a gift we are not affording ourselves.
You know, I'm not as pessimistic as you are, because I see it coming back in droves. Our training centers are bursting at the seams again. Psychotherapy, psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic psychotherapy programs are hugely oversubscribed.
Really?
Patients come looking for care from somebody who can talk with them.
Wow.
It's coming back.
Wow.
It's interesting.
And
the
they're willing...
pendulum is swinging back. People pay out of pocket. Clinicians pay out of pocket for training.
Because you wonder if people can just become increasingly automatonic and forget about it. Just
I think
keep
we
on,
bottomed
you know.
out. I really think
I wonder, I'm always wondering about different things. I wonder, as a psychologist generalist, can people just call it a day and keep on decreasing the dimensions of their existence, as many of us have?
Unfortunately, they
especially
do,
with computers and
But that's the road to depression. Right?
Oh, we are a depressed culture.
That's the road to depression.
Oh, we are a depressed culture. I got a kick out of one conference one day of, I believe, psychiatrists at a hotel over a Storrow Drive with the cars whizzing around and everything was rushed and compacted in a corner room, and they're looking around wondering why depression is on the increase. I just get a kick out of that. I really do. Or nobody saying, hey, if the children are being seen for depression, some of it because we're more sensitive to it, but a lot of it because they're falling victim to it, in numbers we haven't seen before. I mean, first place to look, no, not Prozac, no, not Prozac. First place to look, analyze, psychoanalytic understanding of what is missing.
Of the whole child, the psychology, the biology, and the context in which that baby lives.
The context in which we're living, precisely. And unfortunately, highly, highly conducive to depression.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the illness of the day.
It is the illness of the day.
If hysteria was the illness in Freud's day, depression and narcissism are the illness of our day.
And images of war, labeled victorious or not, do little to help.
There is no victorious war.
Exactly. There's no victorious war. You know, you talked about transference, and you talked about object relation, the child becoming through the other some and a lot of what he or she becomes. Isn't it the case, being imperfect humans, and that's what we are, otherwise we wouldn't even talk about psychoanalysis, we wouldn't bother to go to school to study. We're very imperfect. Isn't it the case that imperfection and legacies of imperfection are handed down through people?
Sure, as well as strengths and resilience. Absolutely. And really the goal of psychotherapy is to break the legacy, if at all possible. You know, I have people who are very worried about their kids. The best thing they can give their kids is healthy parents, right? If the parents can get their lives into a healthier place, that's how you can break the negative legacy. But sure, of course, there are generational and intergenerational illnesses.
And there's this whole model of punition, that the severer we hurt you, the more you're going to, and that's a dynamic thing. That's a very dynamic thing. It's so dynamic, it infiltrates our sexual life. And Freud would say that our sexual life infiltrates our whole life. And by that he didn't mean fornication.
Right. No.
He meant the libidinal id.
The drive.
Exactly. The drive of being alive, feeling, touching, exploring, and you know, having an urge, of life force. And this whole idea of punishment, and it's become very popularized with behaviorism, of which I've studied a lot of behaviorism at very sophisticated levels. But I even notice I definitely disagree with the model of even timeout and that word consequences, and this, you know, a punitive attitude behind a lot of this.
It's funny how that persists, despite the fact that we know that positive reinforcers work and negative ones don't.
Exactly.
And that persists, right?
It does.
Better than it was.
Which is a dynamic.
Better than it was. We're not so happy to see children beaten.
Right.
You know,
oh, yes.
There's been a healthy amelioration of it.
I will grant you small evolution over time. I will grant you that.
But there's a place to go.
We are, but it's not very rapid. And yes, and the idea of punishment too. We see it in the war. The United States government, they use it. I've actually heard generals say that the initial bombing was to give them a certain number of bombs and then say, "How do you like that? Are you ready to change yet?" And then when they weren't, give them more bombs. They actually think, and they call it psych ops, they actually feel they are conditioning behavior with a punitive model. And you've heard the president often speak that we're going to reward. They actually said about Palestine that they weren't going to talk with them because they don't have behavior that deserves that kind of reward.
Well, political machinations are what they are and don't have a whole lot to do with psychological reality, I think. You know, these are political games.
They are political games, but they come from humans
human
in action,
impulses,
human impulse, humans in action.
Oh, yeah.
And you can always imagine, too, that what you see at the top is just a bigger version of what you see at the so-called bottom. And we've got to stop thinking of ourselves as top and bottom. We've got to start thinking equilateral. Equilateral. Oh, we're just a happy family. One big happy world. What is that? We Are the World, that song, We Are the World. All right. All right, well, I think we're going to have to stop here for now. It's been a very great pleasure to be talking to you. Is there any final words you would like to say?
Yes, well, I have great hope. I think human beings want to be healthy. I think human beings want to not feel ill or unfair. And that's what brings people. It's a real...
But are they willing to do the hard work?
I think so.
You think so?
I do believe so.
People, living isn't easy.
I believe so.
Living isn't easy. And and your mind, and all of our minds, is such a wonderful, infinite thing, and the inner psyches of your soul, what the Greeks called soul, which is what psyche means, are unfathomable and glorious and wondrous. So please take heed, perhaps, to check more into who you are, and if you're relating, and you can't force relationships, but...
And to examine the inner life.
Examine the inner life and take people for how they are as best you can, and try to get yourself relating with others on a genuine level and not for some specific utilitarian purpose, just for the sake of relating with other human beings.
Just for love.
Just for love. Do it for love, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Anne Alonso, Director of the Center for Psychoanalytic Studies at MGH and Professor of Psychology in the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good evening. This program is brought to you by the Psychological Services of Dr. Nancy Mroczek.